I think because it's in the DNA of Focolare, a lot of the initiatives that were born, a lot of the projects that Focolare do were really born as a response to divisions around the world, to situations of war, or economic inequality, and divisions amongst people of different faith groups. So a lot of the initiatives from Focolare were born for that. So if we think, for example, of some initiatives that were born from Focolare that you might hear about over the next few days, we can think, I can share a little bit about the young adult branches of the Focolare. They really kind of came into being in the 1960s. So if we think of like 1950s, 1960s Europe, especially, because that's where Focolare was born and then slowly started to spread, or quickly started to spread around the world. We can think what was happening in the 1950s. It was like the height of the Cold War, right? There was like missile crisis, space race, the Berlin Wall went up. And as a response to that, many things around the world were happening as a response to all of those things. So the civil rights movement, if we think of the 1950s and 60s, right, like how the civil rights movement was really coming into a new and fruitful chapter. And there was all of the, for better for worse, there was all of the student revolutions around the world as well, right? We think around about students were really asking for change. They wanted things to, they were asking for equality. They were asking for peace. They're asking for an end to the Cold War. And so in the midst of this, also Focolare members felt called to respond to things like the Berlin Wall going up. And so young adult branches of the Focolare movement were born, and also the teenagers and children came quickly afterwards. So young people who really wanted to, like their peers around the world, they wanted to respond to all of this division, but wanted to do it with scripture in their hand, right? Wanted to do it as a response to Jesus' prayer for unity, that all may be one. And so also at this time, another branch of the Focolare was born, the Volunteers of God, people who are professionals in the world, who wanted to really bring God onto the streets, right? Like take God out of the convents and bring him into the streets, bring him into the workplace. And so that branch was born also in the midst of all of this, in the midst of Berlin Wall, Cuban Missile Crisis, space race. That's where these groups in Focolare came out of. Then if I go into the 1970s and 80s, right, there was tensions in the Middle East that were like growing. It was becoming more and more of a hotspot, and it was causing suffering, I think, for Focolare people around the world. Because one of the great things, right, of being a Catholic organization born in the time that we were, is that there was also the media developing, right? So if you think of the young adults or the families that were in countries where there was not violence, where there was peace, knowing that their Focolare family in Lebanon, I don't know where, I saw Fadi this morning, but we didn't get to say hello to each other, but I know that we have someone who was in Lebanon in those years, right? So knowing that our family members in Lebanon, our family members, wherever there was war, were suffering, projects were born out of that too. And so in 1985, in the 1970s, there was a big youth event born for Focolare called GenFest. And we'll hear about that a little bit tomorrow from Arlene, who will be sharing a bit about that. But the GenFests were born. And so in 1985, the GenFest was called Outbreak of Peace. So instead of Outbreak of War, there was Outbreak of Peace, right, as a response to all of these unrest. So if we think, I mentioned the Middle East, but you can also think Latin America and the economic crises that were happening there. And so there was the Outbreak of Peace, and a lot of youth projects and young adult projects for the Focolare were born out of that. And so that was a little bit about the 1980s and kind of what happened there. Then 1990s, so Sasha mentioned that she grew up knowing the Focolare movement. I did too. So in 1990s, I was like awkward middle school kid who was also a member of the Focolare movement. So a lot of us, I think in the room, we're getting to a point in history where a lot of us in the room remember it. Not all of us, right? But a lot of us. And there was like the such a debt crisis, right? Or I remember learning a lot about the different in the 1980s, 90s, like how in many African countries were affected by famine. And so again, in the world, there was a response to that, right? Or like there was the Gulf War. That was something that was also like very present for me as a like early teen. But I guess the response to that in the world, there was lots of things happening, like Live Aid. I don't know if everybody here knows what Live Aid is. If you don't, Google it. Good stuff happened at Live Aid. So musicians getting together to raise funds to help debt relief, to help famine-stricken countries. So there was a lot of that kind of action happening in the world. And likewise, as Focolare, we felt called to respond to that too. And so a lot of great projects were born, like the Economy of Communion, which is an economic project to help overcome that economic division, right? And you'll be able to hear lots about that if you go to the workshop on business and economics. They'll tell you more about that. And I think there was a lot of people who came for a wraparound event with the Economy of Communion that some of you already met yesterday, right? Is there anyone here who was at yesterday's Economy of Communion? Oh, what? That's a lot of people. So so that's when it was born, right? Like as a response to this like huge economic division in the world, the Economy of Communion was born. Another thing that happened in the 1990s was a pact between the founder of the Focolare, Hearth, and Imam Worth Deen Muhammad, who is a leader in the African American Muslim organizations here in the U.S. So Harlem, New York, Kara Lubick met with Imam Muhammad and very spontaneously made a pact that they would live for each other's communities. And from there, the Focolare community and the community of Imam Muhammad became sister organizations. So I don't know if we have anyone yet in the room from that organization. I know there's a bunch of people registered from Imam Muhammad's community. Some of them I think are only coming tomorrow. And so we'll see those guys, and they're like a sister organization for us. Also in the 1990s, so again, middle school Kate, it was really exciting because we would have meetings, international meetings for the young people that live the Focolare spirituality in Rome. And I remember in 1990, we were finally able to have at those meetings our peers from Eastern Europe who until then couldn't come to those events, even though they were super close. I was coming from Ireland. A lot of them were coming from a lot closer. But because of the Berlin Wall and the Eastern Bloc, they weren't able to come. So exciting stuff in the 1990s too. I started college a few days after September 11th. So like going into the early 2000s, we think of like there's a lot of things happening, like the clash of civilizations was becoming a big topic, especially after September 11th. And there too, Focolare felt called to respond to those divisions. I heard someone yell really happily and loudly when Sasha mentioned Philippines earlier. Who's from the Philippines here? All right, I see a hand over there. Okay. So there's some wonderful schools of formation in the Philippines for interfaith dialogue. And they were really like coming into their own also as a response to that like clash of civilizations that was being spoken about a lot. Also, there was interfaith meetings were happening in international interfaith meetings in Rome at the Focolare Movement's headquarters in Rome. And actually there's one just happened, like they're continuing till today. So one just happened last May, I think. And again, we might have some people here who are at that. I know Renata was, and maybe tomorrow. I can't see who's waiting. Is that Alberto? I was like, who's wearing a baseball cap? It's probably Alberto, right? That's all I see is the cap. But so there's some people who are at that interfaith meeting, and so those were born too. So all of this to say, it's a bit to bring you into what Focolare does, who we are, but also to say that it's really in the DNA of Focolare to respond to situations of division. And so that's kind of brings us up a little bit to today. And why on earth did we dedicate these 2 days to peace, right? It was kind of an interesting decision. We all felt that in our hearts when we were getting together last year to start planning. But peace is such a wide word. It's such a broad word. Sometimes we all understand different things when we talk about peace. I don't know if Andy Gustafsson is here already today. Maybe he's also arriving a little bit later. But he was talking when I met with the group that are preparing the workshop on business and economics. He was saying sometimes we think like, leave me in peace. I want to be in peace. For me, often means like closing my bedroom door, turning the lights off for a bit, and just like, which is important, right? But Andrew was saying, so that's one type of peace, right? But another type of peace is also being disruptive and saying there's something wrong with this system. There's something like there's inequality here. And so sometimes peace building is uncomfortable too, right? And so we all understand different things about peace. So there was a conversation, should we do this, should we not? But we really felt called to dedicate these 2 days to peace. And one of the big inspirations for it was a meeting that Pope Francis had with some representatives of the Focolare Movement. I know from North America, we had Erica and Rico at that meeting. Erica and Rico, you want to wave? There they are at the back. They were there. So there's representatives from around the world who were in Rome because Focolare was celebrating 80 years, so the 80th anniversary of the movement. Pope Francis met with these representatives, and it was a beautiful meeting. If you want to ask, that's why I got them to wave. If you want to hear more about it, feel free to ask them. But one of them, a big theme that Pope Francis was mentioning when he met with this group was peace. He was talking about how today's world is, he said it's a broken world. There's still so many conflicts going on. To quote him, he said, today, unfortunately, the world is still torn by many conflicts and continues to need artisans of fraternity and peace among individuals and nations. And so that was the inspiring spark for these 2 days.